The morning I got handcuffed outside a courthouse, I hadn't broken any law, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't even spilled my coffee. And the wildest part is the officer who cuffed me thought he was the one in control. Yeah, that happened. And if you've ever had one of those moments where you realize somebody decided who you were before you even spoke, then you already know the feeling that hit me right in the chest that day. I was standing in the plaza just before a meeting suit pressed notes ready in my head, sun barely warming the stone steps, and everything felt ordinary until I heard a voice behind me say, "Sir, sit down." I turned, thinking he meant somebody else, maybe a guy behind me, maybe someone off to the side, but no. He was looking straight at me, eyes locked like he'd already made up his mind about something. I said calm as I could, "You talking to me?" And he didn't blink, didn't soften. Just said it again slower this time, "Sit down." Now I've worked long enough around law enforcement to know tone matters more than words, and his tone wasn't curious, it wasn't cautious, it was decided, like a judge hitting a gavel before hearing the case. I asked him why, simple question, respectful voice, and he said, "Stop reaching." My hand had moved maybe an inch toward my coat pocket, that's it, and I lifted both hands open so he could see them. Told him I was grabbing my ID, asked if that was all right. People nearby started doing that thing strangers do when tension creeps into the air, slowing their steps, pretending not to stare while absolutely staring. He stepped closer, hand hovering near his holster, and said, "Hands where I can see them." I remember thinking they are where you can see them, but I didn't say it like that. I just asked, "Am I being detained?" And he said yes, just like that. No explanation, no hesitation. So I asked the next logical question. For what reason? And that's when the silence hit. Not the peaceful kind, the thick kind, the kind that feels like a storm deciding whether to break. Turns out a guard had radioed in about a suspicious person near the courthouse. Description was basically male medium build standing there. That was enough. He looked at me and saw that description, and once that picture formed in his mind, everything I did fit it whether it made sense or not. I told him calmly I was standing in a public place, that I hadn't done anything illegal, that I was asking for the legal basis of the detention, and he snapped back, "You're being uncooperative." That almost made me laugh because I hadn't moved except to breathe, but I didn't laugh. I just said, "I'm complying. I'm speaking calmly. I'm asking a lawful question." A couple people had phones out now, not obvious, just subtle, like they were texting, but the cameras were pointed our way. He shifted his stance, that tiny posture change officers make when they're deciding whether to escalate, and said it again, "Sit down." I paused half a second, not out of fear but calculation, because in my line of work I've learned something. Sometimes the smartest move isn't resisting, it's recording not with a camera but with your mind. So I told him, under protest, and I sat on the step, set my briefcase down slow, the metal clasp clicking louder than it should have, and the whole plaza felt like it leaned in to watch. He thought he'd gained control right there. I could see it in his shoulders, but what he didn't realize was that witnesses change everything. Then came the line that flipped the switch, "Hands behind your back." I said I'm not resisting, and he repeated it slower, sharper, and a second later the cuffs snapped shut on my wrists, cold metal biting just enough to remind you what they're for. Somebody in the crowd whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." And another voice said, "He didn't do anything," and I remember thinking, good people see this. As he walked me to the patrol car, I asked one more time, calm voice, steady tone, "Am I under arrest or detained?" And he said, "Detained for non-compliance," which told me everything I needed to know, because legally that sentence didn't hold water. The ride to the station was quiet except for the engine and his occasional glance at me in the mirror like he was trying to solve a math problem that wouldn't add up. I sat there breathing slow, cataloging details. Time, route, badge number, every word he'd used, because I knew this wasn't over, not even close. When we got inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and he told the desk sergeant I was a non-compliant, suspicious subject. I said politely, "Sir, I'd like to present identification," and slid my credentials across the counter. The sergeant looked down, leaned closer, then looked at me again with a different expression, the kind that says, the story just changed genres. He picked up the phone, made a quick call, nodded, once hung up and turned to the officer and said, "You might want to uncuff him." The officer frowned, asked why, and the sergeant held up my ID and said, "Because that's a state oversight commissioner." I watched the realization hit him in real time, like a light switching on in a room he didn't know he was standing in. He said, "What real quiet?" And I told him calmly what I do, that I review misconduct complaints, that I ensure procedures are followed, and that my detention had no legal basis. The cuffs came off fast after that, real fast, and the room got real still, like everybody suddenly remembered they were part of the scene. Now, most people would have walked out right then, maybe shaken, maybe angry, maybe relieved, but I didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten, didn't lecture. I just straightened my sleeves, picked up my briefcase, and said, "I'll be documenting this," and you could almost hear the air change again. By that afternoon, I had timestamps from Plaza cameras, statements from witnesses, copies of dispatch logs, a full timeline down to seconds, because this wasn't my first time seeing a situation like this. It was just the first time I was inside it. Within a day, videos people recorded started circulating online. Within 2 days, the department opened an internal investigation. Within a week, the officer was suspended, and once investigators started digging, they found something interesting. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were prior complaints, similar stops, similar escalations, things that had been brushed aside before but didn't look so small anymore under a spotlight. A month later, he was terminated, official reason listed, procedural violations and unlawful detention, and then came the lawsuit, and then the settlement, and it was a big one, the kind that makes headlines. Reporters asked me how it felt, what I planned to do with the money, whether I felt vindicated, and I told them something that surprised them more than the verdict did. I donated it, every dollar. Because for me, it was never about the money, it was about proof that calm can be stronger than authority, proof that knowing your rights can change the outcome of a moment that might otherwise go very differently. Proof that sometimes the biggest mistake someone makes is assuming they already know who you are. But here's where it gets complicated, because depending on who you ask, this story means two completely different things. Some people hear it and say, "See, the system works. The officer faced consequences, reforms were made, justice happened." Other people hear it and say, "No, the system failed because none of that would have happened if I hadn't had credentials, if there hadn't been witnesses, if there hadn't been cameras." Same story, two truths fighting for the last word. And honestly, I still think about that morning, sometimes the sound of those cuffs, the way the crowd went quiet, the look on his face when he realized who I was. And I wonder what the ending would have been if I'd just been another guy in a jacket with no title, no badge, no audience. You know what I mean? So now I want to hear from you. Do you think what happened to me proves accountability works, or does it prove it only works when the spotlight's on? Tell me what you think, and if you've ever seen a moment where someone got judged before anyone knew their story, share it, because conversations like this are how we figure out whether justice is really blind or just sometimes looking the other way.